Thank you. Well, listen, Randy, it is so good to see you this morning. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Randy Blacketer, and he is a longtime friend of the Meter Center, and we have enjoyed having him in the Meter Center really for the last while working on a major project. And this is the project we'd like to discuss with you this morning, Randy. So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the context of your project? What led you to start this work to do a new translation of Calvin's Institutes?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be here. I love the Meter Center. Of course, I've been working there since I can't remember how long I've been working at the Meter Center. Uh, but I wrote my PhD in the Meter Center on Calvin. Well, for quite a few years, Richard Muller has pointed out problems that he and other scholars have had with the last translation. And so he had been pressing for one of his publishing friends to publish a new edition. And it went through a kind of an evolution of how we were going to do it, maybe revise an older translation. That turned out to be totally unworkable. But he was envisioning an edition that had less of a layer of modern theological interpretation on the text and to present a more historically oriented edition of Calvin's Institutes. And so now I I became available at that time to do this, and we decided we needed to translate it from scratch, and that's what we're doing. I'm going through the Opera Selecta, which is the critical edition of Calvin's works, published by Karl Barth's brother Peter, Wilhelm Niesel, starting all the way back in, I think, 1928. The first volume came out, and I think they were done in the 1950s. So that's the basis of my text. And I also check the French as I go along. There are a lot of very interesting variations in the French that some of them shed light on who Calvin's opponents were, mainly not necessarily Thomas Aquinas, whom he never read, but his contemporaries who were teaching theology in the Sorbonne. And he frequently refers to the Sorbonne in the French, which is not so evident in the Latin.
Yes, for the audience for which he was writing in French, that seemed to be
Correct.
the target, right? Exactly.
Right.
So as well as being here as the director of the Meter Center, I'm delighted that we have Sam Ha with us, the curator of the Meter Center. And Sam, I believe you have some questions as well for this project. Oops, hang on, Sam, you're muted for some
We
reason.
can't hear you, Sam.
There we go. There we go.
There we go.
Again, thank you for being here, Randy. Appreciate your presence at the Meter Center. So my question is this, what is the process of translating and editing like? Who are you working with, and what are your roles and what are their roles?
So my job is to provide a translation. So I go through the Opera Selecta, I translate it, I go through the footnotes and also edit the footnotes. And I selectively translate the footnotes because some of them we would consider to be much less relevant. So let me just tell you who else is involved first before I get too ahead of myself. A&S Lane, Tony Lane, is the general editor from the London School of Theology. And then Professor Kirk Summers from the University of Alabama, who's a classicist, checks my Latin to make sure I don't make any big mistakes or anything like that. And it's very good to have somebody checking, or at least in my case, at least two people checking my work, and then editors at the publisher who are checking. So that really helps to have as many eyes as possible on the translation. But I was talking about the footnotes for a second. There are 127 references to Thomas Aquinas in the McNeill Battles translation of Calvin's Institutes. Calvin refers to Thomas Aquinas twice, 2 times. So there will be around 2 references to Thomas Aquinas in our edition, because Calvin never read Aquinas. And in fact, in those 2 references, he gets Aquinas wrong. So what you get with the McNeill Battles edition is the impression that Calvin has a thorough theological education and has read all of these important theologians. He has not. He does not have that kind of an education. He teaches himself as he goes along, and he doesn't always get it right.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to prevent or to present a more historically grounded text of Calvin's Institutes.
I think it's a wonderful project. So, who would you say is your intended audience here? Because obviously there are lots of editions of the Institutes. People may already have, McNeill Battles, and now there's a new translation. So, who do you see buying this? Like, who's the target here?
Well, one thing I noticed when I was teaching is that students sometimes struggle with archaic language and the antiquated language that you sometimes find in translations. And so students, when I'm writing the translation, I want to have students in mind. I want to preserve technical terms that sometimes can be obscured when people write in too folks or translate in too folksy a way.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up obscuring technical terms that should be translated in a certain way. So first and foremost is college seminary students. Secondly, we definitely want it to be useful for scholars and interested lay people who may be interested in Calvin's thought.
Yep, I think that's great. And I'm thinking of Elsie McKee's translation of Calvin's French Institutes. I think that is done very well as an accessible, well-crafted translation. I'm very hopeful yours will
Right,
be in the same vein.
right.
Sam?
Randy, I know that you are really well versed in Calvin's thought as well. So have you found a few different ways of translating which then have changed your perspective on Calvin's theology and thought?
That's an interesting question. I think that I had uh, pretty good grounding in Calvin's thought studying with Richard Muller. And I don't think that my view of Calvin has changed that much. My view of the last translation has changed considerably. And the way that the last translation has obscured Calvin.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, last night I was counting up 39 times in which Ford Lewis Battles, I would say, mistranslates the word reprobi or reprobara, which means the reprobate or to reprobate.
Mm-hmm.
He translates it 31 times, he translates it as the wicked.
Mm-hmm.
But in Calvin's thought, I mean, theoretically, you can translate it that way. But in the context of Calvin's thought, that's not correct. He's talking about those whom God has rejected and left in their sins, very specifically. And he uses a generic term to translate it. He has some kind of an issue with reprobation. This is clear because 8 times he translates the verb to reprobate as to condemn, which is just plain wrong. 8 times in the context of Calvin's discussion of election and reprobation. So I think that people have been given a mistaken image of Calvin's thought on this as if it's obscure and unclear. No, Calvin's not obscure and unclear. The translation is faulty.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm really observing now.
Translation is, I mean, that's what a lot of people don't realize about translation is how much it is, in fact, how much we depend on the translator to give us the sense of the other person's meaning, but it's not a mathematical equation. You can't just take, okay, this word
Right.
means that word and go on because it doesn't work in the other language.
Right. And there are maybe once or twice in the translation where it should be translated wicked, where he's talking about a reprobate son. Well, you don't really say a reprobate son, you say a wicked son, a son who doesn't appreciate his parents. There's one time in which that's justified in the 97 times that the word reprobate or reprobara is used in the Institutes.
Absolutely. So what would you say has been either most challenging or most interesting about this project, or a bit of both?
Sometimes they're the same thing. Um, sometimes there are phrases or sentences of Calvin that are just plain difficult. They are quite difficult to untangle. And there have been 4 other translators in history. So there was Thomas Norton in 1561, while the Institutes was still warm off the presses. He had an English translation. There was John Allen in 1813. There was Henry Beveridge in 1845, and then Ford Lewis Battles in 1960. And there are some sentences where I look back at all four of them and I think, yeah, nobody really figured that out. It's really, there are some obscure bits, but often what they don't do is go back and check the French, which often helps to clarify the meaning of the sometimes obscure Latin. And the Latin can be very laconic, so it's leaving bits out that are understood, or at least they would have been understood in the 16th century, not so much in the 20th century.
Absolutely. And that's part of it, isn't it? It's trying to understand almost the code that's going on as you do this. And just as a side note, should any of our listeners or viewers want to see these editions, the Meter Center has all of them. You want to come and see the 1561 Institutes? We have it. We can bring it out and show it to you.
Yes, and the 1561 makes some improvements over the 1559.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, and there are even more errors that have been corrected in Calvin's own hand, and Max Engelmar talks about that in his book on Calvin's Factory.
Yes, and he gave us an absolutely wonderful presentation on that subject at the International Calvin Congress this past summer. That was just great. Sam?
Brandy, I really enjoy whenever you come to the Meter Center, and I know that you're not coming here just to see me. I know that's a big part of it, but I know that's the only reason.
That's most of it.
Thank you. But I know that you're coming here for the resources that we have. What kind of resources have you found most useful? Like, what are the things that have you found most interesting to work with in terms of translating the institutes?
Well, one of the things is you have all of the critical editions, which are very important. You have Jean-Daniel Benoit's French, which is very important. You have especially the resources I need for footnotes that the interlocutors of Calvin and who he's having conversations with, who he's arguing against and carrying on polemics against. So, for example, Servetus's works, which are not easy to find. I go to the Meter Center for that and similar kinds of resources. And the Heckman Library in general has great resources beyond the Meter Center. So,
and we're always delighted to see you come. So just to close out, tell us how far along you are, and then what's the timeline towards publication?
So I am just finishing book 3, chapter 24. I have one more chapter left of book 3. That is on the final resurrection. And then book 4. I hope to be finished with the translation in the first third of 2026. And then, of course, there's a lot of production that goes into it, editing, typesetting, copy editing, checking the translation from Kirk, going over everything with Tony. So my guess is 2027.
Wow. And will it come out in like 2 volumes, do you think, or one big one, or how do you know? Do you know anything about that?
I have not heard a final decision about that. However, in July, the Golden Booklet of the Christian Life is coming out as a kind of preview.
Great. And we're looking forward to that. That's going to be very exciting. Well, Randy, we look forward to your next visit to the Meter Center, whenever that will be. And we're always delighted to have you. And thank you for this project and this gift to the field of scholarship. This is wonderful.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.